Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for December 6th, 2019. Now, if you're like me, if you've looked at candidates for any federal office, people who are running for re-election or running as challenger, basically everyone who's done this in modern time, except a few minor exceptions, you've either considered them to be totally awful on the Constitution, or at very best, they're just hopefully less bad than their opponent. Now, the founders warned us that this could or would happen, and today we are talking about the power and danger of factions. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We have video versions on a number of channels. I think it's up to 8 now, and a podcast audio only edition on 4 or 5 different channels. You can find all of those places to follow the show and subscribe, plus all of our archives, all of our social media channels, the ways to support us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I am incredibly grateful for you spending some time with me today, and since it's the Fast Friday edition of the show, I'm going to do my very best to not take up too much of that time. Let's see if I can get this done in about 10 to 15 minutes. First of all, let's start out with James Madison, who in Federalist Paper number 10 famously gave his definition of what he talked about as factions. A lot of the founders talked about it almost interchangeably with parties as we know them today. But this is how Madison described it in Federalist 10. He said, "By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community." That's Madison and Federalist 10. The whole paper that he wrote was actually very interesting. I will link that in the show notes. That'll go live maybe a half hour to an hour after this live broadcast is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So Madison, that's kind of a foundation for how we're understanding factions, just groups of people working together either for good or for bad. There's potential. But they were very concerned about factions becoming powerful and doing really bad things. And George Washington, in his farewell address, which was originally drafted by Madison, this is 1796, he gave this address. He really went to town talking about political parties and factions. And he was talking about the danger of parties. And then he went on and he said, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism." So one party wins one time, and then the next time they assemble all their forces, and you got to take over, and the other side's got to win, and you go back and forth and back and forth, and it's really all about party, and there's no principle. It's just about getting Team A to defeat Team B, and then vice versa. He calls that, just that back and forth alternation of power, a frightful despotism. But he went on and he says it actually gets worse from here. He says this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men, he said, to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. That sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Washington goes on. He says, "Sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty." And this sounds to me like the expansion of executive power year in and year out, no matter who is in the White House, no matter what party is running things in Congress. Executive power continues to expand and expand and expand. That's how I see this playing out today. But it wasn't just Washington and Madison. Even Hamilton was talking about this as well. In the Federalist Papers, over and over, he talks about factions, and not in a positive way. And here in Federalist 21, very short and sweet, he says, "A successful faction, being successful, may erect a tyranny on the ruins of order and law." And then again, in the series called The Defense from 1792 to 1795. This was in 92. This is the first one. He talks about these parties. This is natural. You should expect this. Jefferson mentioned this as well. People are going to kind of align into groups that fit with their views. And that, he says, this is going to be found in all governments. And he goes on, though. He says, but there is no political truth better established by experience, nor more to be deprecated in itself than that this most dangerous spirit. So they considered party spirit to be dangerous, something to actually be concerned about. He says it's apt to rage with greatest violence in governments of the popular kind, and is at once their most common and their most fatal disease. And in Federalist 10, Madison was really railing on a pure democracy because it would lead to this type of a frightful despotism through factions. And that's a very similar view that Hamilton was taking here. And I'm no Hamilton fan at all, but when you nail it, you nail it. These guys were all very consistently opposed to this. And he was talking about in the popular government, so popularly elected government, it ends up, this spirit enables the leaders of the parties to become the masters and oppressors of the people. Washington had the same view a few years later, again in 1796 in his farewell address. He was talking about how some people were, at least at that time, were looking at parties as a good check, a supporter of liberty. But he was saying, no, 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 this is only the case really in a system of a monarchy. And he actually says this is probably true. And in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of a popular character, in governments purely elective, like ours, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. That's an understatement, I think, from Washington there. He says, from their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit, that party loyalty, party over principle, for every salutary purpose. So you're going to choose one side or the other for every issue known under the sun. And there being a constant danger of excess, he goes on, the effort ought to be by force of public opinion to mitigate and assuage it. He says, otherwise, it's going to consume everything. This is incredibly dangerous, again, from George Washington. Going on, we know that this was not just a new thing. John Jay gives a great example in a letter to Washington the year earlier, talking about this was a general understanding in the history of governments that factions destroyed liberty. And this is how Jay put it in this letter. It was 1795 to George Washington. And Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He says, the history of Greece and other less ancient governments is not unknown to either of us. Nor are we ignorant of what patriots have suffered from domestic factions and foreign intrigues in almost every age. So students of history, the founders, they knew that in almost every age, what type of pains were caused by faction, domestic factions. That's John Jay, the first Chief Justice, to his friend George Washington. And Thomas Jefferson wasn't as wildly opposed on this, but he did point out, he said that the happiness, and this was, I think, 1801 or so, so he was already in office as president. He says the happiness of society depends so much on preventing party spirit from infecting the common intercourse of life that nothing should be spared to harmonize and amalgamate the two parties in social circles. In other words, he's like, man, this party spirit gets so bad, it creates just a societal ruin. So we got to keep this out. Party spirit is dangerous, even to Jefferson. But one of my favorite quotes on this comes from Thomas Paine. And this was from a speech that he gave. I forget what it was called. Let me scroll up here. First Principles of Government, 1795. So this was in France. And he's talking about general foundational principles of government, things to think about. And this is right near the end of the presentation. And he put it this way. It is the nature and intention of a constitution to prevent governing by party. The nature and intention of constitution of a man, I should say that again. Thomas Paine said, it is the nature and intention of a constitution to prevent governing by a party. This is one of the goals of having a constitution, so you won't have government by party. He said, by establishing a common principle that shall limit and control the power and impulse of party. This is very similar to the types of things that James Madison was saying in Federalist Number 10. This is how they were, when they were structuring the government, the republic, a federalist system where you didn't have tons of power centralized in one place. That is one way to control the interests of factions and party. And Paine goes on, he says, and it says to all parties, thus far shalt thou go and no further. This is a line in the sand is what he said. But he goes on, in the absence of a constitution, men look entirely to party. Without a constitution, they're looking totally to party. And instead of principle governing party, party governs principle. And that to me just hits home so strongly because today, in essence, because the Constitution is constantly ignored, only used as a partisan tool, totally defied, disrespected at all times in Washington, D.C., and probably at every other level of government, that we really are in an absence of a Constitution. And today, all we see is party governing principle. We are ruled by party, and everyone that you talk to just about says, oh, what's the problem with the government? They'll say, oh, we got to stop the left or we got to stop the right. They never talk about a foundational principle. What does that even mean? So many times they come so close to each other and they just differ around the edges, but they really don't have a foundational principle other than supporting their own side. And another, I included in my 10 favorite quotes episode that I did a few days ago on Monday, one great quote early on from John Adams in 1763, talking about how he would never prostitute his tongue or pen to either side. Strong words there. But another one that he said that I think was in 1780 or so, he wrote to Jonathan Jackson. He said, there is nothing I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties. That's his greatest concern. Others had considered other things, like Madison said war was the greatest threat to public liberty. But here, John Adams is talking about the division of the republic into two great parties as his greatest worry. Each arranged, he goes on, under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution. In short, we were warned over and over and over. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, make sure to smash that like button, leave a review, subscribe. You can join us for as little as $2 a month at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And more importantly, I hope you learned something in this episode, and I hope you have a really great weekend. I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.